somebody said, I think all of Raph's games are about the fundamental interconnectedness of all things. And I was like, oh, yes, that's me. That's
Yeah,
it. That's what I like making games about. We are simulating every cubic meter of the environment. If you make this intricate world simulation and then the only thing that players can do in it is kill, well, why'd you bother? Right?
Raph Koster has forwarded our understanding of game design for decades. In 2004, he wrote A Theory of Fun, pretty much a must-read for game designers. He was lead designer on pioneering MMO Ultima Online before leading the creative team on Star Wars Galaxies. Now he's back with a new MMO called Star's Reach, which is built on a fascinating 3D cellular automata-like system to simulate the galaxy. Already, the behaviors emerging from this kind of simulation are hard to compare with anything else. So strap in, we're going deep on the game design theory in this one. That's what grokludo's for. And in the second half, we'll talk more about what to expect from Star's Reach. It's the type of thing you rarely find time to do when you're pumping out 8 stories a day on Kotaku, but I wanted to kind of like trace the genealogy of certain mechanics and something as small as like a parry in like a combat, trace it all the way back to the beginning in the same way. I guess there's like a sort of tradition of that in literature and stuff as well. Like I think it was Jorge Borges who used to just kind of for fun trace philosophical concepts all the way back to the Athenians and stuff.
Yeah. Funny enough, I actually was answering posts on Reddit today where somebody said, hey, it seems like the Pac-Man genre died off. Are there modern examples? And I'm like, you're not thinking of it carefully enough. The Pac-Man genre is actually the visit every location on a map genre, and Qbert is one, and so was Miner 2049er and Bristles. And I gave them a bunch of early examples from the 80s. And I said, but it evolved into visit specific important locations on the map. And today we call it a secrets system, where you have to go find specific key dots to pick up. Instead of saying, oh, you got to pick up every dot, we only pick up the locations that have interesting dots. And that is in everything. And now you hunt for stars in Mario, right? Or you find secret pickups hidden in Uncharted or Tomb Raider or whatever. And I think a lot of people don't deconstruct mechanics enough to walk through them that way. So I love that idea for that. You should go do that.
It's funny you mentioned that because like I actually reread A Theory of Fun ahead of this. And unfortunately I had the old version. I didn't have the second edition.
Yep.
Yeah, it was you were talking about in terms of video games, a lot of games are variants of the same game, whereas in board games, they do a lot more innovation on the actual underlying abstract and mathematical problems. That was one of the questions I wanted to ask you, is that how much of that do you think is transferable? Like, is there is that due to an inherent limitation of video games, or are there genuinely things that video game designers can learn from the board game meetups where they do a lot of that?
The practice of game design is the same, whether you're doing it on tabletop or in digital. I think the difference there is more cultural than anything else. Tabletop has certain constraints that digital doesn't, right? Around real time, around kind of the processing time for simulating stuff. You could, in theory, simulate in tabletop to the degree you do, but it would be tedious as hell, so nobody does, right? And in general, in tabletop, it's harder to have certain kinds of hidden information. Processes have to be more public, right? But I think that's some of what led tabletop to being very deconstructive, right? About how they look at a game. These days, you read the back of a tabletop game, and it will say, "This is a worker placement game with an action point mechanic and a double blind auction system," or whatever. Like they'll be very mechanical in how they describe it, whereas video games are very experiential now. And I think a lot of people have real trouble separating the mechanics from the surface that they see. And we could. We could do that. We could assemble collections of mechanics more. But instead, we tend to give genre names to particular collections of mechanics. And it's pretty rare that we actually invent new mechanics or fresh combinations. Instead, what we tend to do in video games is ring changes on the content, the art, the theming, um, the pacing, the data, that kind of thing. And so most games are actually clones of one another in video games.
I guess it's quicker iteration on the board game side, isn't it, as well? Because,
Yep,
without having to code anything, like you can go to a board game meetup and you might have planned a rule set, and then someone else at the table says, "Well, what if it was a bit like this?" And then you can just kind of do that without having to go home and code it.
that's right. Yeah, it's a lot easier to do rapid iteration with tabletop. I actually strongly encourage people who are learning game design to start with tabletop and not just jump straight into computers. I think having the pace of iteration lets you get some lessons under your belt faster.
That sort of difference between the underlying mechanics of games and the aesthetics of games, it's something that we've discussed on this podcast before. I've had on academics specifically to talk on about loot boxes and loot box regulation and stuff like that. And it's something that's come up because I think, like, most of the time, it's fine for only designers to be thinking about those underlying mathematical problems and the abstract concepts. And for the most part, players are free to just kind of enjoy the fictions and the set dressing that lie over a game. But when it comes to policy, that's where it kind of this issue of a lack of ludo literacy kind of becomes a problem, where it's like, our policymakers, I guess the age old problem was talking about violence in games, where and there was a section about this in A Theory of Fun as well. And I was thinking to myself, I've lived this, because if you talk to a person who's played a lot of a game, they're not even seeing the aesthetics anymore. They're just seeing the underlying mechanics. And I've interviewed several esports pros who, if you were to say to them, to a Counter-Strike professional at a tournament, after he gets a headshot, if you were to say, "Wow, that was gory," he would just be like, "Huh? What?" Like, I was just making the calculation of, vertical and horizontal mouse flick.
Yep.
And it's also kind of a problem when it comes to loot boxes, because policymakers kind of don't see gambling unless it has those visual gambling motifs, even if the underlying system is a gambling system.
I mean, uh, so there is a generational factor, but it isn't that different from, and frankly, any other field that gets technical, right? It's not like a legislator knows about headlight brightness and the correct angle at which to place the bulb for the headlight in a car, right? They have to write legislation around it, but in pretty much all democracies, there's a system of a variety of things that you have in government experts, bureaucrats who learn how things work. You have lobbyists who represent the industries who can come and be brought in. And sometimes it's to pick their brain, and sometimes it's for them to, try to get advantage, right? There's staffers who do research, all of that, right? Because you can't expect a given legislator who's been elected to a term and who knows nothing about it. They still have to vote on the legislation, but they're probably not going to be experts on headlight angles or on double-blind trials for a medicine, or on, I don't know, regulating some financial instrument. Right? Like so they're not experts on any of those things at a detailed level. There's staff that have to be, though. And the real risk is if there's no staff and no industry knowledge and no nothing, that's when you get just cuckoo stuff, right? That's when you get stuff that just doesn't make any sense at all. Because it's not like even players necessarily always see the intricacies of when something is really turning into gambling. One of the classic examples as regards loot boxes is, yeah, we can all say, oh, there's something off about that daily loot box that I walk up to and I roll a die and I get an output and it's trying to get me to buy something. But we don't have any problem with I'm off playing Diablo and there's a random drop that only happens once every 10 hours. But I know that if I kill enough skeletons, I have good odds of getting a something. And it's like, those are actually almost identical, right? From a technical point of view, from a game design point of view, the differences are much more about uh, what surrounds the randomness mechanic there. Because you don't want to remove randomness. That would be bad. We count on randomness in games everywhere. So yeah, it's tricky, and you have to be able to see specific kinds of dark patterns.
Yeah, I guess all the way back in 2011, I think it was, I did my first story on how kind of everything in an MMO or RPG setting is a gamble. It's like when you mine the rock, you might get the gem. When you attack, you might get the crit. Do you think? But I guess yeah, it becomes more of a problem when it's like a planned sort of a variable reinforcement schedule.
Even getting the gem is a variable reinforcement schedule, right? I mean, um, it really actually becomes a problem when you're tying it into the commerce aspect, right? And there is the question of whether just pure random reinforcement might be addictive. There's that. But even that, there's kind of the gap between gambling and just addictive or compulsive behavior and compelling and, and just randomness. Um, when we run a foot race, right? This has happened countless times in real life sports. The weather that day and where the sun was and what clouds happened to come out and how wet is the track. Those are all randomness too. And we think of those things as, from a game design point of view, those are just statistical variation in the content, right? The system is the same, running the foot race, whatever. But the terrain is a little bit random. The level design was a little bit different. I had a chance of the gem. I had a chance of the sunbeam in my eye, right? Like, games rely on that kind of randomness because otherwise they'd be puzzles. Otherwise, if you know that there are no random variables, then there's always going to be an optimal solution through.
It's like, yeah, it gives you the chance to improvise based on that randomness. I guess there are like some philosophical differences in the types of randomness. Like there's, rock, paper, scissors is like, subjectively kind of random, but it's like the other person actually deciding something versus like, the environmental randomness that you mentioned versus like a genuine random number generator. And I guess, all that's pretty academic until you get a situation which probably is rare, but you could, I guess, theoretically get a situation where a company alters its odds for a loot box uh, uh, mid swing, like, while the race is happening. It's like, actually,
Yeah.
we
And
don't want to give
that's
away that many.
no, and that's outright, that's a dark pattern, right? That is. I tend to prefer thinking about randomness in general as being about that variation, that statistical variation, right? Because it really helps to kind of reduce your assumptions about what's happening, right? And if you start thinking of it as, oh, this is statistical variation in the problem set, to any given individual, the complexity of the world might just seem random, right? I mean, that cloud blocking that sun or the sunbeam hitting you, technically that's not random. It's just math we can't follow, right? Like there's nothing random about the rate at which vapor moves in wind. It might be chaotic, but it's not random. And but to the human perception, it's above the threshold that we just go, well, I don't know. Therefore, we call it random, even though it's not. Um, get enough other people that you're interacting with, and things become very unpredictable, right? Some designers think in terms of input randomness and output randomness, which are basically different ends of randomness. Input randomness happens at the moment that the player does something. Output randomness happens like rolling the dice after, right? And those are different, and they have different kinds of outcome. They're different processes, right? One is, let me inject some randomness with my action, and others is, I might have a fixed action, but the output might vary, right? Those kinds of things, they're all tools in the designer toolbox. And, you know, saying that any given one of them is bad or pernicious is really, really hard, because they're just basic. They're kind of like basic moves, you know. It isn't until they're put inside generally like a commercial structure or something like that that we really see dark patterns emerge.
It's funny because, when we're talking about tracing the genealogy of certain game systems, one of the ones that I was really interested in looking at was rolling a die to see if a soldier fired a shot and hit his mark or not. And, which goes all the way back to like Kriegsspiel.
Yep.
It was especially interesting to me because it's so tied up with loss aversion. And, XCOM players will be very familiar with loss aversion. We're more sensitive to loss than we are to gain. And it seems like when there's 99% chance to hit, we always miss it. And Kriegsspiel it was this, for those who don't know, like a war game that was used to kind of train Prussian officers in the art of war. It included logistics and supply lines. And at first, it was using chess pieces that made sort of chess-like moves. But somewhere along the line, they switched to simulating shots with randomness.
Mm-hmm.
And in hindsight, it kind of seems like the obvious thing. But I was wondering if it was just always going. I was wondering if it was inevitable for them to make that jump, because it does seem like, as humans, anything that we can't properly simulate, there's an intermediary step where we use randomness, like a roll of a die or
That's right.
something.
I was going to make exactly the same observation, because I've said that for years, that in general, when we are simulating a system, if something falls below the threshold we want to simulate, we give it a probability randomness instead. That's it. It's kind of a go-to move, and I think it is inevitable. I think it's the kind of thing that we always do when modeling systems, right? Because otherwise, it doesn't feel, we can't simulate everything, right? It's kind of like that thing, the perfect scale map of the universe is the size of the universe, right? So, we're back to Borges again.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And so it's really, really standard and typical for getting to a certain point and we stop simulating and we just use some form of randomness there to plug the hole, right? Some kind of probability distribution. When we look back at the history of games going much further back than Kriegsspiel, and think about it from more of an anthropological sense, right? Or more of a cultural history sense, what we see is that much early game playing seems to be about dealing with the concept of fate and dealing with the concept of unpredictability, and is tied in with fortune telling and all of this, right? And so, often even early games that we don't know the history of, like the game of Many people have, concluded that the game of is fundamentally a philosophical statement about a human life, and it uses randomness. The links between the classic deck of cards and the tarot deck. The use of divination in old Roman games. I could go on, right? There's many, many things that connect this notion of, we don't quite know how to predict this, but if we play with it, we can start building mental models of probability distribution. That's kind of at the heart of play, right? Is let me take this system I don't understand, poke it, prod it wiggles in particular ways that I don't understand why, but the more I
Yeah.
do it, the more predictable it gets, right? That is play, but I want to poke it to get this outcome is the act of play, right? You get better at it by practicing on poking the thing. Um, but it's also kind of the scientific method, right? You form a hypothesis. If I poke it here, what's it going to do? And once you get it to something reliable, you go from hypothesis to theory to that's a fact. I know how it works now, right? Um, so to me, those concepts are very deeply intertwined and very human.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. So many potential jumping off points there, because I was recently reading James Paul G's book, the "What Video Games Have to Teach Us About Learning and Literacy," which talks
Literacy.
about how the similarities of the scientific method and what we just kind of naturally do in play. But when you describe it like that, it sounds almost like the similarities that occur across civilizations between early games are inherent in how we would design a game due to our psychology. And it's almost similar to how Joseph Campbell would describe the similar mythologies that spring up across civilizations, in that, it was kind of always going to be this way because we all share this psychology. Like, we were bound to have similar mythologies, and maybe bound to have similar games and games of chance as well.
Yeah, maybe. I do think that we do see, even in really old games, really strong cultural differences that represent qualities of cultures, right? Like Senate, those games are too old for us to really understand them, really know them, right? Um, uh, we've reconstructed rules for and so we think we understand what that game is, right? Um, for those who don't know, I guess you have listeners who may not know, but the game of is a die rolling game where you have to go from one end to the other of a track, right? But the weirdness in it is that each player starts on their own track, and then there's a long middle strip in the game where you're both on the same track. And then you have to roll perfectly to get out at the other end. And you could think of these almost as the way these work is you have like a childhood period where you're not intersecting, not competing. You're just trying to roll and get out of childhood. Then you have the
Mm.
long shared track. And the thing with the shared track is if you land on another player, they're out and they go back to the beginning. They have to be born again. And then at the very end, the track splits again. And now you're in old age and you're not competing with each other anymore. And, you can see that as a metaphor for fairly cutthroat kind of existence, right? At least this is our reconstruction of it and how we interpret it now. Um, but we don't when you look at later games, right? Because that one's ancient. That's like Babylonian, right? But if you move forward in time to see games like the Toffel family of games in um, Nordic countries and or the Mancala family in Africa, these also seem to encode qualities of how the cultures worked. So the Toffel family is um, it's essentially a combat game, but it's very different from chess because it's asymmetrical. You have one side plays the raiders, and the other side plays a king and his band of defenders. And that side has to get the king off the board, and the raiders try to capture the king. So it's almost like a fox and geese kind of game. But it is very much sort of about like your Viking band with a jarl and his soldiers, right? Um, Mancala is a game about planting seeds, and many of the rules in different parts of Africa, you lose if you win by too much, because that would
Ah,
mean that you want to be successful at planting, but you don't want to cause everybody to starve because only one person ended up with all of the crop, right? Like these things end up encoding cultural values. They end up encoding things about the way that the people at the time saw the world. Even chess, the making of the queen into a powerful piece, was a response to what was happening in European politics, where powerful queens were becoming dominant political figures, and it got encoded into the game, right? So, yeah, I think games end up, since they're modeling and simulating things, they often end up reflecting the mindset of the culture that played them.
That's fascinating. Talking about those early games and coding the cultural values, in your book, you kind of lamented that a lot of the popular games today, they sort of satisfied, or they taught skills that were kind of evolutionary obsolete, and they satisfied compulsions that perhaps don't serve us very much in the modern day, like, hunting and jumping over rivers and things like that. And as I mentioned, the version I was rereading was not the more recent version, so maybe this is something that you updated in the second edition. But now that gaming is more mature, and we've had the indie explosion, do you think that that's changed?
It has changed a lot since the first edition of the book was written. There's a line in the edition that you read, actually, that outright says, "What happened? How come we have no games about farming?" Well, that sure
Yeah,
changed,
yeah.
right? But there weren't any at the time that I wrote the original edition. Um, yeah, I think the big thing there is that there are things that are easy to simulate. It is very easy to simulate force projection and capture or kill, territory and so on. It's really easy to simulate those. And so they're kind of go-to tools, right? We know what mechanics to use. We know what code to write. It's very straightforward to just stack in shooting and jumping and running over and over again and end up with games that fundamentally are still teaching us kind of the same reflexes and the same patterns of thought as always. Um, I think there's kind of two strands to even thinking about what happened with indie games, because there's sort of a thematic experimentation angle, and then there's a formal experimentation angle, right? And when the innovation works the best, both of those are happening together. But there's an awful lot of thematic experimentation that doesn't necessarily bring with it mechanical experimentation, innovation in terms of new game features or truly novel game designs, right? So I think I wrote years ago an example of a game about healing, right? As a thematic flip, it would be incredibly easy to make an RPG that was exactly like an RPG today, except that you're a healer instead of a killer. And what you're doing is putting hit points back, right? And you could make exactly the same MMO or exactly Diablo or whatever. And all you're doing is, instead of killing them, you're turning them from near dead to alive. And that would, on one level, that would be radical because it would force us to like re-examine assumptions. But on the other hand, mechanically, it's not, right? Like it isn't inventing anything novel in terms of a system, right? Um,
It's still like an economy of health that
right.
you're.
It's still just an economy of health. The only difference is whether numbers are going up or down, right? Really is the only difference. And of course, as we know, if you just redefine health as sickness, then it could even work exactly the same. You could just diminish
Yeah,
the
yeah.
amount of sickness, take it to zero. Now the person's left healthy. Yeah. So it's yeah. I do think there's an enormous amount of the indie space which has pursued exploring thematic areas that games didn't cover, but doing it with just, we have platformers about grief. We have platformers about fitting in. We have platformers about, um, um, so I think that there's nothing wrong with that. And it's good to see that kind of thematic experimentation happening. Um, but I do often wish we saw more of the other side of things, the formal side of experimentation, the invention of new mechanics. I've even seen I see this fairly regularly hanging out in like game design subreddits and whatnot. I hear people say all the mechanics have been invented. And I'm like, no, that's like saying all the math has been invented. It's a
Yeah.
bottomless pit. There's so much more out there for us to go do. Um, and of course, the trick to pursuing that is is as simple as trying to simulate whatever that tricky topic was. Can you simulate grief? Simulate fitting in? Like as a simulation system, not as a bit of story that you stick on, right? Um, and that kind of thing, I think, can lead to completely new forms of gameplay, and is how we really expand the field in the end. Um, so I personally would love to see both, and I wish that we saw more of that mechanical experimentation. What I tend to see is mechanical experimentation usually only happens when we get some new technical capability that
Yeah.
forces us to try out some new mechanics.
I've kind of felt a similar way about criticism. Is a lot of critics that I've talked to over the years do focus a lot on the thematic and the aesthetic and the narrative, and some have even just outright said to me at meetups, all I care about is graphics. If a game has good graphics, I'm giving it 10 out of 10.
Yeah.
Um, and I do wish that there was more focus sometimes on and it does take more effort. I get that if you're playing an RTS and you really want to make objective calls about the balance between asymmetrical factions, it requires a lot of playtime, and that, talking about the graphics doesn't. But yeah, it's one of the things that I wish I would see more in the criticism space. I think now, in terms of I guess the equivalent of the indie explosion in games, like the sort of criticism equivalent of that is YouTube. And now we are kind of seeing more of that in YouTube, right? Like there are some YouTubers who do kind of specifically focus on that.
Yeah, although I'll have to be honest, and this might get like vast swaths of fandom angry at me, but I think that the vast majority of YouTube discussion of game design is pretty shallow. Um, I think that the length constraints, the fact that by and large it isn't practitioners doing it, it's players doing it. Um, I think there's generally a real lack of historical context where people don't know the history of games all that well. I, I find a lot of it, particularly I know a lot of folks who say, oh, I don't want to read any game design books. Just point me at game design YouTube channels. And I'm like, there really is no substitute at the moment for reading the 10 best game design books. You're not going to find the equivalent of that on YouTube. It just doesn't exist. It just doesn't. But yeah, I think a lot of YouTube criticism is it's player centered, not craft centered. You know,
Interesting, yeah.
and there's nothing wrong with player centered criticism. But if you are trying to be a better game designer, it's only one lens and not necessarily even the most important one. You do have to learn about the craft itself, not just how players react to it, right?
Yeah, and I guess a lot of that is not very content friendly. Like, because when you're learning about the crafts, you do kind of have to go back to these really basic and abstract things that don't maybe visually pop in the way that a YouTuber would want it to. Like, if you were to go back and whether it's playing retro games or some of the more interesting experimental games that interested me were I don't know if you remember when Jason Rohrer did a series for The Escapist where he tried to encapsulate an emotion with a game,
Yep.
and I thought he did a really good job of that. He would sort of take a concept like perfectionism and make a game out of that. I thought that was super interesting. And then you've got I think back in the 2000s or maybe even before, I'm blanking on the guy's name. I think he worked for EA. He made a game called The Marriage.
Rod
I think it was
Humble.
Rod Humble. That's it. Yeah, yeah,
Yes. Yeah, you're describing the art game movement, the original art game movement of the early 2000s. That actually, it was a movement that was partly inspired by Theory of Fun and other writings at the time. There was Brenda Romero's game Train,
yeah,
which was tabletop, but was also the title of that series of games she made was "The Mechanics Are the Message," and that
yeah.
kind of sums up what both Jason and Rod were trying to do at the
And could
time.
you
They were
explain Train just quickly for those listening?
Yeah, Train was a game. It's an art game in which players are essentially attempting to a packing problem where they're trying to pack figurines into a train and deliver them to the destination. And then at the end of the game, you learn that you were participating in the Holocaust, and it's meant to be um, a pretty overt message about complicity, right? That by
Mm,
participating according to the rules, you are being complicit. And the game tries to signal to the player in a whole bunch of ways that, hey, the rules you're operating within are not okay. Like the game is literally played above broken window glass to echo
right.
Kristallnacht, right?
And
so
it's like hard to pack the people. It's like it's hard
yeah,
to get them in the
it's hard to
train.
get them in the train. Yeah, exactly. It's very much aimed at forcing you to think about, wait a minute, why am I playing this? And I've had debates with her about what is the right way to play it, right? To
Mm,
not play it, to
yeah, yeah,
subvert it, to play to lose, right? Um, but the key thing there is that the mechanics are aiming at delivering the artistic message. Like that is what is doing it. There's no story in Train.
yeah.
There's
It's
a
only
no,
at the end,
yeah,
right, that you're told like the
yeah,
train has made its way to the concentration camp, and then you're like,
yeah.
whoa, hang
Wait,
on, what?
what? Yeah, exactly. There's no story really in the marriage. The marriage is a very personal expression about what it feels like to be in a particular marriage where the characters are abstract shapes and they're just they just have rules like um, they get bigger when they're near each other under certain circumstances. In other circumstances one shrinks the other, and eventually there might be new shapes that appear if they spend time together, and that wears them both down and so on, right? And it's a metaphor for, you know, moments in a marriage and how it affects things. Um, but there's no story. And in fact, if you don't read the paragraph on the webpage, you don't even know it's about people. You think it's just shapes. In Jason Rohrer's case, it's there. Many of his games do layer on more story a little bit, like Passage, for example. You are moving, you start out as a young figure and you get older and older as you progress and eventually keel over dead. And there's another character joins you for part of the journey, but
Mm,
eventually you part and then the whole point of that movement was finding ways to have, call it the formal side, the mechanical side, the simulation side, convey artistic messages, not just putting story on top of a platformer or putting story on top of something else. It's not that putting story on top of a platformer is bad, but I think it can likely never be as resonant as those moments where you are involved in the choices, right?
absolutely. There was a paper that came out, and I don't really think the paper proved what its main point was, but I just found its point interesting, which is that in instances where the mechanics don't really line up with the theme or the story. So, people will talk about ludo-narrative dissonance.
Hmm.
People usually talk about that as a flaw, and if the game itself is conflicted, then the player will feel conflicted, and it'll take them out of the immersion because they'll feel like what I'm doing here is not really lining up with who I'm supposed to be embodying. But the paper was talking about how it could maybe be used as a tool, like a narrative tool, rather than just as a flaw to sort of ram home a point in the way that I guess juxtaposition could be used in a painting or something like that.
Mhm. Yeah, I think dissonance there or consonance there, once you understand the basic principle, you can play with it, right? I think when we talk about getting better at the craft, it's about learning those tools for your tool bench and then deciding whether or not to pick them up or to what degree to use them. That becomes up to you kind of moment, right? As a creative. Um, there are many examples where something we might call dissonant have made for powerful experiences in games. I mean, we talk about breaking the fourth wall in theater and TV and books, right? That kind of dissonance is a form of breaking the wall inside of a game, right? And we see that happening from again that same time period. Ananthropy's dysphoria, for example. There's a moment where you have to play a Tetris piece and put it someplace, and it is physically impossible to do so, right? Like that's breaking the expectation of the player in a very particular way. Um, so I think a lot of it is about just learning what some of these craft tools are and then figuring out ways in which you can apply them. Um, I don't think that, you have to always aim for perfect ludo-narrative consonants or whatever, but I think it's more telling if you are building dissonance without even being aware of it. That's very different from if you're doing it on purpose, right? And I
Yeah.
think that's the distinction between being a conscious craftsperson about it and just being naive about it.
Yeah, yeah, you have to be like Picasso said, I learned the rules so I could disregard the rules or something
Yeah.
like that. So a theory of fun comes out, and then uh, there's this art movement that we're talking about, and a lot of exploration around the abstract side and what kind of communication can be done with things like moving shapes when you subtract almost all theme and almost all story. In your book, one of the main themes that you touch on, I guess you kind of opened with it and ended with it, is that you were contemplating your grandfather's skepticism about games as a vocation and as an art form, and you arrived at something like Pascal's wager, where you said that if I take this seriously and choose to be very responsible about it, if I'm wrong, then whatever, I was a crackpot all along. But if I'm right, well, even if I'm a crackpot, then at least I haven't harmed anyone.
Hmm.
But if I'm right, then I would have taken this art form seriously in the earliest days of understanding it, and sort of been one of the first to kind of create a map of the territory. So now that the indie explosion is in full effect, and that the art movement has happened, and I guess is still happening. Um, have you seen any games that sort of nudge you towards that latter conclusion of
Oh yeah.
you being right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think at the time that the first draft of that book was written, um, we had only recently been uh, considered to even be protected speech in the United States, protected artistic expression. There was active debate about whether or not games were an art form or not. Among game developers, it was an
Yeah.
active debate. Many developers were like, that's not an art form. It's just entertainment product. It's not,
Yeah.
can't be art. That was a thing I got told by mentors, actually. Right? Um, that attitude is dead. It's dead and good, I think, because I think now there's no question in people's minds that games are a medium. I think one of the things that has happened more and more since the book was written is video games have evolved more and more into not being games per se, right? There's more of whole swaths of video gamedom are primarily narrative, not particular game-like at all. They're, we have not just visual novels, but all kinds of experiences where the mechanical piece is truly, truly minimal. And it is in the service of expressing things that um, only interactivity can express, but not necessarily games. Artful Escape was an Annapurna game. It's sort of a platformer, kind of, except you can't lose. There's no way to fail at the platforming. You're a kid who wants to be a musician, and then you get abducted by aliens to participate in an intergalactic rock tour. The game consists of you sliding sideways, and you can express music and jump and do all this kind of stuff, but yeah, it doesn't really matter how well you do at the jumping. And periodically you play an incredibly simple game of Simon, and that's it. The vast majority of it is about the feeling of zipping and sliding and expressing these musical notes as you go. And it feels awesome to do, but it isn't really a game in the classic sense. It's just pure play. And
Mm.
I think we've seen more and more of that kind of thing where um, we have more software toys than pure traditional games these days, and I think that's good. That's not a bad thing at all. I think bringing back just the sense of play and exploration is important. Um, the other side of it, we do have the Dark Souls kind of vein, which is very, very gamey, very, very challenge driven and mastery driven, right? So to me, it's been great to see that overall expansion of the palette, right? Um, the fact that, gosh, in the early to mid 2000s, I could literally lay down the boxes, because we still bought boxes of games, and lay them all down on the floor, and 80% of them would be a burly dude with a gun, right? And
Yeah.
it's not that way anymore, right? And I think that's wonderful and is exactly what you would expect from people starting to take the medium more seriously as an avenue for artistic expression.
Yeah, and even, to further the point on the Dark Souls, so I mean, it's like super gamey and super refined, like, combat mechanics and stuff like that, but also on the storytelling element, kind of pushing forwarding the idea of an interactive story. I mean, obviously, there's been choose your own adventure books for a long time and things like that, but the idea of a story that is not even there unless you engage with it, and a story told purely through level design and actions that you see and item descriptions, is like, that seems to be like there were so many different things that Dark Souls did that people kind of copied, but that seems to be one of the more important ones. Is like, when we talk about what a story in a game can do differently than a story in a book or a film, I think Dark Souls kind of hit on something. And my friends are all going to be laughing right now because, they criticize me for always somehow bringing it around to Dark Souls. Like,
Souls,
what
it
does
was
this
my
have to
fault.
do
I
with
brought
Dark
it
Souls,
up.
Jeremy? Yeah, yeah.
I brought it up. Although I'll say, that idea of telling a story in that, I'll just say environmental storytelling, right? Telling a story in that more environmental way, um, is actually from a very non-gamey side of things that came out of that indie explosion, right? And in fact, the kind of people who love Dark Souls, many of them were the kind who sneered at Gone Home, Project Esther, things like that. Dear Esther, and what was the other one? Proteus, right? Which were very experiential, just go through, and people said, well, where's the game? Well, guess what? Now Dark Souls is built in part on that kind of stuff, right?
Yeah.
And so this is why I always kind of say, you got to watch out what you call not a game.
Hmm.
The lines between toys, puzzles, and games, those lines can be very blurry. I think it's important to have craft terminology to understand this is a game in a classic sort of ludology sense. But from a what players can play with, I mean, players can play with a ball, right? It doesn't take much to provide an interactive experience that players can build a game on top of. And so excluding the end product doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I think we can be precise in terminology while still being inclusive in terms of what we count as a game.
You talked in your book about evolutionary psychology and sort of the cognitive theory.
Mm-hmm.
And when I read memoirs from storied game designers, like, for example, I was going through the Sid Meier memoir, and
It's a
I
good one.
think I've seen, I've had multiple instances of this where they seem to have independently arrived at concepts that I would also read in, like, a Daniel Kahneman book, where, like, Sid Meier talked about how he always felt that players needed to win 70% of the time to feel like they had won 50% of the time, which is something, like a loss aversion that Kahneman would talk about.
Mm-hmm.
And as someone who's uh, read quite broadly on these subjects, I was wondering if you've, in the course of your research, you've ever been reading about concepts like that and thought to yourself, I know that, I I kind of stumbled
All
on
the
that while I
time.
was making games.
All the time. I started reading, and I'm not ashamed to admit it. I started reading pop psychology first, right? And then started reading some of the original papers and whatnot, digging underneath it. Yes, there were all kinds of things out of psychology, but then since I worked in MMOs, obviously also out of economics and sociology and anthropology that ended up really resonating. For me, one of the biggest career revelation moments was actually when I learned about the science of social networking, which came along before social networks, right? Like we shouldn't confuse them, but the whole thing is 6 degrees of separation and Dunbar's number and the way human networks form and all of that stuff. And it was so deeply relevant to what I was doing in MMOs at the time. And I ended up talking with people in the field and saying, we observed this in our game and we have data. And they'd be like, you have data on this?
Yeah.
Like, um, because, a lot of what they were doing, they're trying to gather data on it. And I'm like, I have a petri dish with hundreds of thousands of people in it. I can see the social graph literally, right? Like, that kind of stuff. Um, we take it more for granted, but in the early 2000s, it was not right. Like, um, it was one of those things. It made the news when they used that science to figure out who the ringleader of 9/11 was,
Oh,
right?
wow.
Because they were able to trace who talked to who and identify who the ringleader of the terror cell was. Um, so yeah, that kind of crossover has happened to me a lot. And it's happened a lot with social stuff. It's happened a lot with psychology of learning. Um, it's happened with economic things a lot. I know that, for example, um, modern monetary theory and economics is something the economists debate a lot. But there's an awful lot where I go, that's exactly how it works when I'm being God and running an economy of an MMO,
Yeah.
right? Like it works this way. And we know that we have data on it. We can see how it operates. Um, that kind of thing happens to me a lot. And it has happened with a bunch of theory of fun over the years. Bits of stuff that I speculated in theory of fun or just claimed, asserted, right? Lots of bits of it have gotten um, validated by later studies. Like Nicole Lazaro, for example, had her 4 kinds of fun, right? And and I said, well, we really have this kind of fun and we have these other things. Maybe we shouldn't call them fun because they involve other kinds of things. And I was focusing more on pattern matching and problem solving and that kind of thing. But her ideas and mine were super complementary, and she is a trained psychologist, right? Well, way later, out come studies about different kinds of human enjoyment and which ones are activated by which human hormones. And it turns out that there is a breakdown very similar to what we were both talking about. That,
Mhm.
oh no, well, that one is because you have, serotonin plus dopamine gives you this, dopamine alone gives you that. And it was like, oh, well, there it is, just as we predicted. Um, Things that came up in sports training and deliberate practice and things like that end up reinforcing it. There's all kinds of interesting things like that where it often feels to me like people working in training, in education, in psychology, especially around hormone stuff and endocrinology stuff, um, and in game design and in a few other fields, it often feels to me like we're all touching the same elephant and just
Mhm.
using different language to describe, you know, flow versus deliberate practice versus this versus that. Those are coming from very different subfields out there. And yet, game design is a place where they all kind of meet.
And in the course of working on UO and Star Wars Galaxies, you had to research a lot into different forms of government, which I guess is a good jumping off point into Star's Reach, because once again, you are playing God, and
Yes.
it looks as though there will be sort of the opportunity for different factions to own a whole planet and a player to run a planet, and politics will be a skill tree.
There are many ideas in Stars Reach that have been percolating for me for 20, 30 years now. Today, the MMORPG genre or label has has come to mean, a particular constellation of features that are a great example of what we were talking about when we started this conversation of just sort of looking at the surface of things. Um, they've fallen back into being, let's make a world that has other people in it, but fundamentally you are engaging in an ongoing treadmill of defeating enemies in order to get a nicer piece of loot so that you can go defeat the next enemy. And that's what the game is about, right? And uh, I got started in online worlds long enough ago to remember when that wasn't the only kind of online world there was.
Right.
There were more things there, and first and foremost, it was about being in this alternate reality. That was the core point, and the activity that you did in there was secondary, right? So with Stars Reach, we're trying to make an alternate reality that happens to be about building civilizations with your friends. Different kinds of people who play in different ways, each of them maxing out their level in that, but the sum of the parts is greater than their individual activity because they form an interrelated web of people who end up building a civilization. They end up forming an economy, settling on a planet, building a government together, and so on. And they do it each for their own selfish reasons, probably. We end up collaborating and competing with each other in all these ways and often don't understand the value that other people bring. I want the game to kind of convey that we're all in this together and we have to solve some of these problems together, even if they're not friends of yours, even if they're not people that you hang out with. I always use the analogy of I'm not friends with the plumber that I tend to call, and I don't know who maintains my telephone lines outside. And I have a vague awareness that there's an enormous amount of stuff under the streets without which I could not live. Um, and I know nothing about it, right? But there are players for whom that stuff is what they enjoy doing. So if they play their power grid game and the other person plays their plumbing game, and I play my kill monsters game, turns out we do all actually depend on one another. One of the nicest compliments I ever got, it was just a random observation on some gaming forum. Somebody said, I think all of Raph's games are about the fundamental interconnectedness of all things. And I was like, oh yes, that's me. That's
Yeah,
it. That's what I like
yeah.
making games about. And so yeah, Stars Reach is a game about that. It's a game about different kinds of people discovering that they need each other.
I'm glad your answer went in that direction, because I was gonna bring up, like, the sort of, there's a whole genre of story designers bringing out a new game, and the marketing department uses the line, the game I've always wanted to make, or the dream game.
Yeah.
And it was at the point where journos would go to E3 with their bingo card, and they would say, "Oh, Molly New said it," and
Yeah.
uh, you know, Will Wright said it. Oh, yeah, oh, Cliff Blazinski, bingo. Uh, so I wanted to take it in that direction of what makes Stars Reach your dream game. And obviously, there's this whole other element that I actually really do want to drill down on, which is the cellular automata element. But it sounds like I'm with this game, but also kind of your games before. There's a strong theme of like simulation leading to emergent behavior. Would that be correct in
Yes,
saying that?
absolutely. Um, and also the social stuff that I described, I think, has also been a theme in all three of the MMOs. I think, I was trained as a writer, as an artist, as a musician, um, and all of those are areas where you exert an awful lot of authorial control, right? I ran D&D campaigns. I wrote my own campaign and module and blah blah blah. Did all of that, and there you still exert an awful lot of authorial control, right? And when you start making online worlds, you start out, and I started out making ones with lots of quests and lots of directed gameplay or whatever, and that's still very much authorial control. Um, but that sense of falling into a world and getting lost and it acting in predictable ways, but not being controlled by an author, having that emergent property, that's something magical that digital games in particular can do better than, I mean, they can do it better than tabletop because you can't have simulation to that degree in tabletop. It's something very unique to computers. And, at that extreme end, we have things like Dwarf Fortress, right? Where the authorial control is at one step removed. It's building the rules of the world, but the world is kind of going on its own, right? And falling into, think how cool it would be to play Skyrim inside of a Dwarf Fortress world where stuff is happening and it's alive and it's around you, right? I mean, that to me feels like one of the ultimate promises of CRPGs, not not the Final Fantasy direction, which is all about control, author control, right? It's sort of the other direction. I think that other direction was also one of the key inspirations for the entire Elder Scrolls series, right? Daggerfall started out it was all procedural, right? It was all generated and dynamic. So, yeah, UO, Galaxies, Stars Reach, very much all leaning into those ideas of simulation. And once you put thousands of people in it, you start realizing it can't just be about simulating the environment. You have to simulate the player activities. And because if you make this intricate world simulation and then the only thing that players can do in it is kill, well, why'd you bother? Right? Um, and from real early on, even in UO, even in the text muds I did before that, there was this sense of there's got to be more to do in here than just kill things, right? I mean, I didn't dream of Middle Earth just to go there and kill orcs. I also wanted to just go have lunch with the hobbits, or whatever, right?
The
It
finest wheat in the South Farthing, right?
Yeah, it wasn't just about the mayhem. It was also about the sense of awe and wonder of being there, right? So, yeah, simulation to me super super important. Stars Reach is built on the idea that we can simulate with modern computing capability. We can simulate these alternate worlds in ways that nobody's ever done before. We're not doing what Dwarf Fortress does in terms of simulating all the NPCs, but we are doing, as you mentioned, a cellular automata simulation. We are simulating every cubic meter of the environment. We know the humidity, the material stuff is made of, what state of matter it is. Things can have chemical reactions with one another. Um, water meets dirt, it turns to mud. When you walk through the mud, you might slog and get stuck. Build a road, and now you won't get stuck. And so stuff like that sounds like it's just there for the cool factor, but actually has all these implications on gameplay. It gives a much better underlying um, substrate, I guess, for crafting, of course, for player building, for the combat. Like, you might be fighting some monsters and they lob heat shots at you, and the forest burns down. And now that affects where you can take cover. And it means that where there used to be forest, that might now be prime farmland. But now the habitat for the monsters is gone, and now there's different creatures showing up, right? Like, it makes the world alive on all kinds of levels. And we've had it now in live testing with players for over a year. And it turns out that having a living world around you really hooks people.
Yeah, I'm super interested in it, and I'm one of those old jaded games journalists who's played every type of AAA game under the sun. So I typically only come out of my cave for an interesting idea. I just happened to be reading this book called Awe. It's all about the feeling of awe and
Hmm.
how it can actually be a healthy thing for us to regularly get a sense of awe in our lives. And there are various cognitive benefits as well, such as the DMN, the default mode network, which is a part of the cortex involved in egocentric thinking, is
Mm,
less active after experiencing awe. And it's also shown to help pull people into system 2 thinking as opposed to system 1.
mm.
So I guess not every game can instigate that feeling of awe, but,
Yeah.
I've always been the type of gamer that, loves exploring systems. So something like this, like, a 3D cellular automata that's a galaxy wide, that's what does the awe thing for me.
Yeah, when we did our very first couple of playtests, one of the things we did was we invited only in like 100 people to run around, and all they could do was run around. But we showed them things like, let me blow a hole in the dam and watch the water flood a canyon, or I'm going to plant a bunch of tree seedlings, and now I've set up we have this thing called a growth beacon that accelerates the growth of trees. And one of the players said that they got a moment of awe because they were standing in the middle of the forest, and they had this moment of, an artist didn't lay this out. The trees grew here, and in fact, were still growing around her. At that very moment, the trees were growing. And she said it basically gave her chills, right? It, yeah, there's something magical about that, even when it isn't tied to a game system, right? Um, but then when you do tie it to the game system and you have that moment where, the weird aliens blasting away at you and the forest catches fire around you, and now you're like, oh no, what do I do? But then you blow a hole in the dam and flood the valley and it puts out the fire, right? Now we're in the realm of gameplay, right? Um, that is novel, that you can't get without having this level of simulation. Um, Routinely, we have players who are going digging and mining and tunneling, which are very used to doing from Minecraft and many other games now. And then every once in a while, they're like, so I dug really far, and then there was a cave in, and it killed me.
Yeah.
And it's like, yeah, were you digging through soft material? And they're like, that can happen? Yes. Why, yes, it can. You might need to build supports as you go, and so on, right? And they're like, whoa. And so sometimes it isn't the dramatic moment. Like, there's a YouTube short of a guy just watching slackjawed as gravel slides down a slope in the game,
Yeah, yeah.
and just going, it's moving. That's so cool. Right? Um, and it's funny because, on the other hand, there was also a different person has a different YouTube video up where they're on the edge of a cliff, and a giant meteor comes down from the sky and lands on the rim of a lake blows a huge crater in the ground. The lake starts to drain into the crater, hits the heated ground, starts to steam up, and he's just going, "Oh my God, that's the coolest thing I've ever seen in a video game." And then in one of the comments, somebody goes, I mean, I can drop a giant nuke in Helldivers. And so they don't even realize the difference
Yeah,
because
yeah.
people are so used to things being faked, right? To it only being in the storytelling layer and not
Mm.
being in the mechanics of the game, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Helldivers is fun, but it's, it's not even in the same universe. Pardon the pun. But, I
Yeah.
guess that kind of like, that kind of solves the MMO content treadmill problem for you as well, right? Like it's this, level of simulation and players creating their own stories.
Yes, it doesn't mean that we won't make our own content. We also embrace a couple of other things that are very different from the main current of MMO design today. Today, most MMO design, because it's about progressing on a treadmill until you hit endgame and then you just do raids over and over again forever, or PvP over and over again forever. Um, each of the zones is basically like a level you move through once and you're done with it. And at the same time, because there's so much emphasis on experience and story, a zone is incredibly expensive to craft. It's, all this handcrafting detail and attention goes into it. It's very expensive, only for it to get burned through by locusts and then sit mostly empty eventually, right? And this has been a dilemma for MMOs for a long time. What happens now in modern MMO design is that um, they let you level and then they say, levels don't matter. You can go back to zones and we'll auto scale everything. And right, like it's almost like a hack layered on top of the original problem. Um, so we said, well, if we're simulating these zones, we can generate zones, and that means we can have as many of them as we want. And we could throw them away and just make new ones anytime. And so we built the game around that idea that the map does not stay put, that instead you discover new zones, new planets, new space areas, chew them up, destroy them, abandon them, they go away, you find new ones, and it isn't a static galaxy at all. Instead, new zones are coming in and old ones are exiting. Already in our pre alpha, people are currently playing in 4 zones, and we have thrown away 8.
Oh, wow.
And we also have a feature right now where a wild wormhole gate opens up periodically, and there's a different zone, a whole new zone on the
Oh,
other
wow.
end each time it opens up.
So kind of like an instanced.
Each of them is fully persistent. If people decide to move in, then everything persists and is saved. So it's only if people abandon a place do we recycle it. And that's just so different from how MMOs have evolved.
Interesting, the whole zone thing because the old sci-fi trope of the one biome planet,
Yeah,
which is I guess Star Wars is the
exemplar.
biggest culprit there of having
Yeah.
like a desert old desert planet or an old
Uh,
jungle planet, which
they stole it from Dune.
oh yeah, there you go. Which in real life tends to not be very realistic
Yep.
or sustainable. But when you have a system like this, I imagine there are so many things that you have to keep in mind. You have to sort of uh, build something that is sustainable, and with these, at least when it comes to two-dimensional cellular automata, typically when you design a system, it either explodes in complexity or it peters out to nothing, or it just it can create these like sustainable moving systems. So what do you have to keep in mind when you're designing like a planet of 3D cellular automata so that it's sustainable and then also, I guess, kind of resilient to terraforming and all the things that the
Yeah.
players are going to do?
There's a bunch of factors there. We had to decide which kinds of materials or resources were exhaustible and which ones were not, that were self-refreshing. And that line was easy. We said inorganic materials. If you extract all the gold on a planet, it's all gone. It doesn't come back. because you literally carved away some of the map, right? Like it's not there anymore. But plants and animals can reproduce. And what we did was we did set max population caps on things, and we have backstops in the gameplay. In our lore, is that this is a terraformed garden of worlds left behind by an ancient civilization. And there are still robots that are tending it and that act as gardeners and backstop it. And you get in trouble if you drive things extinct. So you still can drive things extinct, but the robots will come for you. Um,
Yeah.
that lets us have mechanics in there that do things like keep barely alive populations around, things like that. We backstop the cellular automata with outright spawners that exist one level below the cellular automata. They kind of act like if in Game of Life you have gliders that are the living things and you got glider guns that make the gliders, think of the critters as being like the gliders, but think of the spawners as being like glider guns. And we salt those around the map to kind of provide initial state. Um, and they will replenish things until you destroy them. And at that point, they're not there to replenish things anymore. So think of it almost like a water spring. Like if you plug the spring, no more water is going to come out, right? So that helps give us a backstop that makes things more resilient. You can still destroy it all, but it's more resilient. Then the caps provide, you know, there can only be so many trees on the planet, no matter what kind of thing, which we need for performance reasons and so on. So there's a lot of that kind of thing. You have to design all of your content in a very different way. We don't build single biome planets. We do say this planet has an overall hydrology. This is how humid it is, what color sun it has, what temperature ranges exist. But sometimes those ranges are narrow, in which case you might get single biome, and sometimes they're broad. And there's seasons and climate change and all of it happening. And you might have, tropical swamp on the same map as a frigid mountaintop. And those can coexist. And that means we don't design biomes. Instead, we derive biomes off of local conditions on the map. And based on what the local conditions say, those are the kinds of plants that thrive there. So
Interesting.
that meant we had to go make the art for all the biomes.
Yeah, yeah.
Right? All of them, and make sure that, hey, we've captured a spread. So if you have a planet with a lot of climactic variety, there's something in all the different ecological niches. So yeah, it really does change how you design and how you think about things quite a lot.
It did occur to me that there are all these methods of destruction. There has to be kind of methods of creation as well that are kind of
Hmm.
operating under the hood.
Yes. Not just under the hood, we give them to players. We allow them to do things like, if they destroy that glider gun, which in our case is what we call makers, that's what the spawners are, they can make new ones to repopulate a planet. There's actually if you claim a planet, there's actually a computer that you can install on your planet that is an ecology monitor that lets you see the populations of all the species and what's going extinct and so on, so that players can attempt to actively manage the ecology of their world.
I guess the one of the games that people are going to naturally compare it to is No Man's Sky, which I guess I've seen people describe it as a cross between Minecraft and No Man's Sky, which seems apt. But No Man's Sky kind of introduced us to this idea of billions and billions of different life forms, but they're all kind of they have a limited number of sliders and which might decide like their nose length or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And they just have each slider is at a different point. And together, when you combine all of those, combinations, there's millions and millions. So I guess that sort of introduced a lot of people to the idea of uh, mathematical difference versus like human perceived difference. Because if something's mathematically different, that doesn't necessarily mean that it seems different to a human being. Like if a nose is just 1 centimeter shorter, technically it's a different species, but to a human, it'll just be like, oh, well, it looks the same. So I guess I was going to ask, like, where Stars Reach sort of lives on that spectrum of, like, creating an art asset for everything, and on the other end, like, attempting some sort of procedural generation, or having sliders or something like that.
Like I think what No Man's Sky is doing is kind of a lot like what Spore was doing, which was a whole research project for both teams, I think, for Spore and the Hello Games, right? Um, we're not trying to solve that. It's, it's a big R&D project for us. We're a small team. We're a lot smaller team than No Man's Sky. Um, so we're making variations in our lore because the planets were terraformed. Things appear on multiple worlds, and that's okay. We do procedurally modify their behaviors and things about them so that their speciation has occurred on the different planets. No Man's Sky just isn't an MMO, right? And so I think a lot of people look at us, at the two projects, and they do compare us. They go, "Oh, space game, loads of planets. I can dig a tunnel in No Man's Sky, and I can build a base in No Man's Sky. But if I leave a planet on No Man's Sky, my tunnel disappears. And if I build a base, I can only do it with, what is it, 5 other people, right? This is a game where, a few hundred of you land on a planet and start doing things. So it's a very different proposition in that sense. And it opens up things like a fully player driven economy whereby my planet might be out of gold and or out of water, and I have to import it from your planet, for where you and your guild have colonized a planet that is a water world full of islands, and therefore have water to spare for my deserty planet, and so on, right? So yeah, it's different in that very important sense, but that is the kind of thing which people may not get from looking at a screenshot, right? Which is, I think, one of our challenges in marketing it.
When you talk about 50 and 100 people getting together and terraforming and stuff like that, I know that it's been said that PvP might not be available on launch, but will be coming soon afterwards. And I'm just wondering what considerations have to take place when we talk about a faction owning a planet and terraforming as a group. Like, what kind of extreme terraforming is going to take place when people are deciding to defend a planet?
Oh, well, I mean, that is a ways into the future, and so any answer I give is kind of speculative. We plan on having a three-cornered faction system where players and planets can declare for a faction, and that would enable territory battles to happen on those planets. Um, I do picture some sort of territory control system, but if people own a planet, they have a lot of freedom to terraform and modify it. So it really is kind of up to them. There's all kinds of things that you could do, dig trenches, reroute rivers onto them, melt a mountain into lava onto your enemies is a thing that you can do in this game, right? It's certainly a tactic the aliens use on you a lot. There's several of them that attack with heat attacks strong enough to melt pools of lava under your feet, that you can fall in and die. So, yeah, I think all of those kinds of things are possible. The big consideration for us is that if you allow it, PvP will swallow a game whole, of course. And so
Mm.
it's really important that people who do not want to participate, that they can opt out, that the game does not require participation in PvP in any way if you don't want to participate. So it's all opt in. Um, that's really, really crucial, right? This is another place where that zone-based model helps us, because seamless worlds, setting the boundaries between safe and not safe areas, is full of exploits and cheats and all of that. Here we can say the other side of that wormhole is in wild space, and anything goes over there, and before you go through, right? So it gives us really bright lines for ownership of areas and rules changing from area to area. We have seen over the years MMOs got bigger and bigger and more seamless. And at the same time, we saw a push from players to, I'd rather play with just my friends in a private server, right? Like it's like there was this bifurcation. And we're kind of saying, can the chocolate be with the peanut butter? Can we have that private server feel in a larger galaxy? That's more or less what our architecture lets us do. You and your
Mm.
friends can have a private server and still have trade routes and still have economic contacts, still be able to go visit another server and so on. So you're in one galaxy and one universe. To you, it feels like one game, but we're giving you a lot of the controls of a private server when you claim ownership of a planet.
And it seems like the type of thing that you could just keep expanding as well, right? Like more sectors and more
Yes,
sectors.
we can expand it. And this is really important for a business point of view. We can shrink it too. If
Okay.
people abandon a world because they've used it up, the wormhole collapses, the trade route is lost, whatever. And then we can apply that towards making a new zone instead, right? And stay cost neutral, right? It's not like World of Warcraft, which accumulates all these zones and then they sit empty, right?
Yeah,
Um,
that's right. Yeah.
so we can scale the service up and down. Already during the pre-alpha, we had an event and it was tied in with ongoing lore storytelling that we were doing, whereby there was an alien artifact that came along and it was going to hit one of the players' planets and destroy it. And we did out of the game storytelling via fiction, and the planet was saved, except that it was done in a way that the robots didn't like. So the robots destroyed all the planets anyway, and we destroyed all of the players' planets. They were all blown up, and the players were logged in as the robots rained meteors and destroyed their houses and everything. And we wiped those away, and players had to go find new worlds. So it lets us do things that we haven't been able to do in other games that are really cool.
That's a sort of, I guess you need to make with regards to emergent behavior rising from the simulation and stuff like that. You have to be sort of super careful when you decide to use the hand of God like that, right?
Yes, in this case, the players knew out of character that it was coming and why we were doing it, but we also narrated it in character, and it's led to players doing things like they're kind of building history books now. They're
Mm.
maintaining the history of the planets that they lost and the places they've been that we can't get to anymore and all of that kind of thing. They're preserving the memory because it's already a game that has history to it in that sense, right? Empires fell, you know,
Yeah, yeah.
cities that people knew have been lost and destroyed.
The concept of legacy. The last one I've got for you is just a basic one. I was wondering, it's possible for players to be on fire and there are different status effects. I was wondering if that interacts with the sort of 3D cellular automata as well. Like, does my fire affecting me also affect the 3D cells that I'm inhabiting?
Right now, we have that being unidirectional. Fire, in particular, is it spreads really easily, and so we put really tight rules on how easily it spreads. So we currently have it. It can originate from high temperature from lava. It can set in-game plants and whatnot on fire. It can set people on fire. The plants, fire can spread from plant to plant, but we don't have it that it can spread from player back onto plants or the landscape, because if we did that, we're pretty sure players would burn the whole map down in no time. So we've had to do a lot of tuning of things like how quickly do plants grow back, how like literally we just implemented I think it was this morning, we implemented the feature where when players trample grass, it dies and leaves behind bare soil. We
Huh.
just implemented that this morning, and it's a grace note kind of a feature, right? Um, Grass already grows back over bare soil. So this is just adding wherever players tend to trample, there will tend to be pathways, right? But even something like that, we really have to weigh, well, how fast does it happen? How quickly does stuff grow back? Fire is so destructive. Lava is so destructive. Water is so destructive. We've held back
Wow.
from allowing players to scoop up water and just dump it anywhere because landslides happen and floods happen. We had an incident uh, last year where we had a decorative lake and there was a leak in the lake essentially. And when we filled it with water, it flooded the player's city. And a lot of
Yeah.
players had built basements and
Oh
they had
no.
not lined the basements and the basements collapsed. And so the flood actually had very real consequences. Like the city got massively damaged, and a whole bunch of rebuilding had to happen because of this flood. So we've been reluctant to just hand players the ability to pour hoses of water over everything, because it's a universal solvent, right? It really can destroy things really quickly. So yeah, we have to be really careful with that stuff. We want to empower people, but it's really easy to empower them a little too much.
Why is it that emergent disasters make the best stories, though?
But it's a great story. That's right. So I was actually just now before this call specking the feature that will allow them to redirect water and all of that. But I'm putting a lot of hedges and guardrails on it.
Yeah, yeah. I'm so grateful, Raph. Thank you so much. There's people in this world where it's like, whenever they open their mouth, I feel like I'm learning. This has been a great chat, and thank you as well for sort of your book, A Theory of
Well,
Fun.
my pleasure. You are an uncommonly researched and informed interviewer as well. It's not often that people will throw, Kahneman and ludology at me in the course of one conversation. So
It just happens to be an intersection of the interests. Yeah.
I really enjoyed it. Thanks so much for having me.